بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا سيدنا محمد المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه أزواجه وذرياته ومن اهتدى بهديه ليوم الدين ترك المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك ثم أما بعد. So we're up to the 24th hadith, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And I think we either have 3 weeks left or 4, I'm not sure. So 22nd probably is the last time, yeah. So that will give us today the 8th, the 15th. So 4 more. I think we can, it's possible we can get to the 40. But that's not necessarily a goal, but I mean, some of these ahadith are a little bit shorter than the rest. So the 24th hadith narrated قال الإمام ابن أبو جمرة رحمه الله ويروي بسنده المتصل إلى سيدنا أنس بن مالك عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إن الله عز وجل وكل بالرحم ملكا يقول يا ربي نطفة يا ربي علقة يا ربي مضغة فإذا أراد أن يقضي خلقه قال أذكر أم أنثى شقي أم سعيد فما الرزق والأجل فيكتب في بطن أمه. Anas ibn Malik narrated from the Prophet ﷺ that he said, verily Allah Azza wa Jal appointed an angel over the womb. He says, my Lord a droplet, my Lord a clot, my Lord a piece of flesh. If he wills to complete his creation, he says male or female, miserable or happy. We'll get to that in a second. Then the portion of sustenance and the lifespan. Then the angel writes all of this in the stomach of the mother. Yeah, the batna here doesn't really, I wouldn't translate it as stomach, I would translate it as because it doesn't literally mean stomach, it means just the belly, probably belly, better word.
Maybe abdomen?
Abdomen, yeah, that would work too. Belly, abdomen, that type of thing, yeah. So here we see a hadith that is describing what we call the miracle of creation. And there has been, probably in the past few decades, kind of an emphasis from a few scholars, I wouldn't say many scholars, but a few scholars who are also have some scientific type of background, and they emphasize what they call al-i'jaz al-ilmi, or the scientific miracles. Most ordinarily what's found in the Quran, but obviously you find some of the hadith talking about these things as well. And I think we might have mentioned this before, maybe another class, that the emphasis towards this particular way of looking at things, al-i'jaz al-ilmi, the scientific miracles of the Quran, places, I think, sometimes undue stress on the sacred scripture, in the sense that we try to fit it in whatever prevailing scientific theory may be around at the time. And it doesn't necessarily have to do that. A lot of the Quran, a lot of the hadith can be interpreted in a number of different ways. And for example, Ibn Abi Jamrah, on his commentary in this hadith, he was of the opinion that when the sperm coincides with the, he didn't even say the ovary, the egg of the woman, he said with her semen or with her excretion, this takes place in the vaginal canal for a period of time. 40 days is what he thought, and then it would move on to the womb. And modern science telling us that that's not right, that's incorrect. That it actually takes place in the uterus, in the womb, and then it clings to the uterus in that point. So obviously, in Ibn Abi Jamrah's understanding, and he understands the Quran quite well, and even the hadith, he interpreted in a way that made sense to him. So, and we're not going to say his interpretation is invalid based upon the linguistic purport of the Quran or the Hadith. It can't be, because he's a scholar, right? We could, if he made that egregious error and say, look, he completely misunderstood what the ayah is saying because he doesn't understand Arabic, that's unlikely. But what we can say, if he's basing his understanding on a particular thing that he found in the verse or in the Hadith, and it does not jive with prevailing scientific knowledge, then that's perfectly legitimate to say that. There's nothing wrong with that. So it's clear, or it's important that we make the distinction between the two. What the Quran could possibly be saying, or the Hadith about certain things, and trying to say that it definitely says this. Right? Because most of the Hadith and most of the Quran is what we call dhanniya dalala, which means that it's open to more than one interpretation. It's not qat'i. Qat'i means univocal, one interpretation. There's no other way it could be understood. And there's very few verses in the Quran and very, very few of the Hadith that actually would fall under that. And so, just as a note, I think to be careful with, when the Quran talks about the stages in the womb, or this Hadith, when it says, a droplet and then a mudgha and then alaqa and so forth, and that's exactly how, modern obstetricians and gynecologists understand it in exactly the same way. This proves the Quran. No, it doesn't prove the Quran. The Quran doesn't need that for proof. Right? It's not like the Quran is in need of validation from modern science. It may coincide, it may not, because it's open to interpretation. So here, nevertheless, the Prophet ﷺ relates this for a reason, right? There's a wisdom behind why this particular hadith, why he's telling us that this is what happens inside the womb. It's not just like, he had nothing better to talk about that day, so he said, let me talk about what happens in the womb. There's a lesson in it for us to ponder and to contemplate. And notice the juxtaposition of both the physical development, right? Because we're talking about here the droplet, or the nutfa, which is the actual fertilization of the ovary or the egg with the male sperm. So it's only merely, those two come together and form a single cell. That's the nutfa. And then a alaqa, right? A clot. And alaqa actually from the Arabic language means something that hooks or hangs on to something. So when the sperm fertilizes with the egg and then it hooks onto the inside of the uterus, right? And so that's alaqa, even though it's translated here as clot. And then in mudgha, which means a morsel of flesh, when it begins to develop and clearly skeletal system and circulatory system and all those other things begin to happen with the embryo in the very beginning. And then at the same time he's talking about khalqahu, male or female, its creation. Shaqiyyun am sa'id. Here when it says miserable or happy, it means in an eternal sense. Will they be amongst the dwellers of paradise, sa'ad al-abadiyya, or will it be amongst the dwellers of hellfire, ash-shaqawa al-abadiyya. A'adhan Allah min dhalik. Fama rizq, its sustenance, which I'll get to in a second, and then the ajal, which is the lifespan. So just as we are fashioned within the womb, whether we're going to be male or female, and what we will look like and our features, so also these intangible things that can only be known by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, namely whether you're going to be a person of paradise, of sa'ada, or you're going to be a person of shaqawa, you're going to be someone of eternal misery, as well as the rizq, one's sustenance, not just in a material, physical, financial sense, but even beyond that. So sustenance means both your material, bodily sustenance, what you need to survive, as well as your other type of arzaq, your spiritual rizq, for example. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is omniscient and omnipotent, and all that was and is and will ever be is known in intimate and perfect detail by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why is the Prophet ﷺ reading this hadith? What is the lesson that we're supposed to come out with it? What are we supposed to learn? Imam Ibn al-Jamrah, he mentions that one of them is that just as, and it's interesting, he actually said this in the commentary, he said just as, no one thinks about, if one was born male, no one thinks about becoming a female. He actually said that, 800 years ago. It's like I'm talking to him like, what? People actually do say that now. But he said, just in the same way that a male doesn't want to become the female or the opposite, and they don't try to, it's kind of like a given, then in much in the same way the other things that are mentioned here, your sustenance, it's a given. So why are you trying to change that, trying to be something that you're not? Why are you actually worried about it? No one worries about, man, I was born a male, maybe I should be a female. Even though people do that today, but that's outside the context of what he's talking about. But generally speaking, since all of these things are known ultimately by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is al-Muqaddir, wa huwa al-Murid, and He is the one who made it happen, then there's no difference between any of these, the four things He mentions here, namely male or female, shaqiyun am sa'id, right, miserable or happy eternally, ar-rizq, one's sustenance, and when they will die, how long their life will be. You don't have control over when you're going to die, when you're not going to die. So in other words, all of these, what they have in common is that ultimately you don't have control over it. That being said, then the question that will automatically come is, well, if that's true, right, and it's already written if I'm going to be happy or miserable, then why should I try to do anything if it's already set? So much in the same way that I'm male or female, and I can't change that, then why should I even try to change what my final status will be, whether in paradise or hellfire? Why should I work for any of them when it's already settled? And the answer to that is, yeah, it is already settled. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking you to do something. He never asked us to find our own sustenance. In fact, He tells us quite the opposite. لا نسألك رزقا نحن نرزقك والعاقبة للتقوى. We don't ask you to sustain yourselves, right? نحن نرزقك. We are the ones, here the royal we in the Quran, we are the ones, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who will take care of your sustenance. وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلتَّقْوَى. But, doesn't say but you understand that from the context. The aqibah, right, in other words, the thing that you're thinking about, what happens later after the final abode, it will be determined by your taqwa. In other words, what you actually do, what you put forth, your deeds, your knowledge, so forth, what you try to do. So even though we don't know the final outcome, and Allah knows, that does not preclude us from actually working towards that end. So there are certain things, obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has determined. In fact, not certain things, everything. Technically speaking, everything is determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But with even that determinism, He still asks us to work for certain things. So He asks us for taqwa. He sets a path by which we can achieve taqwa. He asks us to worship Him. He tells us the reason why He created us. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have not created the jinn and the ins, human beings, except that they may worship me. And so then one of the primary objectives of our creation is in fact to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all its various understandings and manifestations. It's not just limited to prayer, but everything about your life can be technically an affirmation or an act of worship. So realizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator and that you are the created, and because of that relationship, then you are to act like the one who is created and not like the creator. And so, in fact, when people try to change that what Allah has determined and has expressly conveyed to us that it's not changeable, then we are assuming a position of being like the creator. And then that becomes a transgression, not just against humanity, but really against Allah, against God. So, trying to change what Allah has already made in you. For example, trying to change your sex to be from male to female or the opposite, right, is a clear transgression, obviously on sort of a level of humanity, but also what it implies. And what it implies is like you're saying, well, God made a mistake. You know, like I hear what people say, I came out male, but really I'm a female inside. I'm supposed to be that. So God kind of made a mistake with that, so I'm going to fix it. That's the bigger transgression, right? That's the iftira. To even make a statement like that, or to think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of having that kind of mistake or that mix-up, and that now you know better and you're going to change it. So Allah doesn't ask us to have anything to do with that. And in fact, pre-modern people, like Imam Abu Jamrah said, no one even thought that to begin with. No one thought about to change their sex, or that they're in the wrong body and they have to do something else. These are all very modern maladies. And they're not maladies of the body, they're maladies of the soul, right? These are people who are, you know, completely just, maybe they're victims more than anything else. I can't judge. But, you know, we're living in a time now where the integrity of the soul is under great threat. Modern life in general does not allow for really a healthy nourishment of the soul. You really have to make a big effort, and you have to go against the grain to kind of endeavor to do that. And as a result, we have a lot of suffering people all over the world, and suffering not primarily in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense, and then that leads also to also their suffering even in a physical sense. So here in this hadith also we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala appointed an angel. And angels are sentient beings that are created from light. They do not have the ability to transgress against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They only worship Him. That is what they are created for. We usually can't be cognizant, aware of them, usually, even though it's not impossible, because we know from the hadith that even the Sahaba saw Jibreel in the form of a man as he appeared to the Prophet ﷺ. But if an angel, so for most people, if you can probably either, not probably, you can either see an angel or maybe you can hear one, but if you both seeing and hearing, then that's only for prophets. So if an angel is directly speaking to a person, then we say that person is either a prophet or something akin to a prophet. That's why Imam al-Qurtubi, he designated Maryam alayhi salam as a prophet, because Jibreel spoke directly to her. Right? In the Quran it's recounted that story when he appeared to her even in the form of a man, and then she said to him, Inni a'udhu bir-Rahmani in kunta taqiyya. I seek refuge from Allah the Rahman if you are a person of righteousness. Because she didn't know how this person got in her tower room in the monastery where he came from. He came out of nowhere, and it's a locked room, and only Zakaria had the key, so where did he come from? So he spoke to her. Hence the difference of opinion about Maryam, whether she was a prophet or not. But most people, we don't have any recognition or any ability to know that the angels are around us. But with each individual human being, there are probably at least a dozen angels with them. So most definitely Raqib and Atid, the ones who record the deeds. Then there are guardian angels. Some of the hadith mentioned there are about 10 or so. Imam Abu Jamrah said some of the hadith mentioned that there are even particular angels that are muwakkal, that have agency over particular bodily organs or senses, like eyesight, like hearing, like the stomach, like the digestive system. So even though we're not aware of them, we're not cognizant of them, nevertheless, they are there. And some of the ulama declare that even angels have ability, much in the same way that shaitan can whisper to us satanic things, right, or things that obviously would lead us from Allah. Then the angels also have the ability to also do the same thing, but obviously in a good way. So one can have an angelic khatira, an angelic thought, an angelic moment where something comes to mind. And they say that usually that's the case when one gets an impulse to do something of good. So you're walking down the street and you see an indigent person and it looks like they need some help, and so it immediately comes to mind, I should help this person. Right? They say that kind of impulse that comes could be, the source of it could be the angels themselves that give the person that particular that particular impulse. Most of those things, there's not really solid kind of unequivocal, sources for it, but it's kind of something that has grown to be accepted as, if not a possibility, even a great probability that that's the case, that they do have the ability to do this with us. And Imam Ahmad Zarruq even said in one of his books, in Nasiha al-Kafiyya, that one of your objectives with the angels is to want them to be in your company. So to try to do things that they like so that they'll stick around. Because there are certain moments where they will not stick around. Private moments, the ones relieving themselves, for example, they don't stick around for that. And so you find some of the hadith talking about certain things that angels don't like they don't go into a house that has a dog or an animate form depicted. So that hadith doesn't say outright it's haram to have a dog in the house, or al-bayt, or something of animate form outright depicted, but it implies that if you want the company of the angels in your house, then maybe that's something you should be considering, right? Ahmad Zarruq also says that angels like to be around people in a state of wudu. So maintaining a constant state of wudu also is something that will procure the company of the angels. So it's something that one should think about when in their daily routine. Yes.
I know that there's a lot of things that sort of angels away. I mean, I've heard them throughout lectures. Is there like a book or something that sort of guides you in terms of like what to do? And also, sorry, second question is about the predestiny, and I know this is complicated, but so are you basically being judged on your amal, like your effort? So like if you are a certain way, say you're like Omar Khattab, and you're a perfect person, what you recognize about yourself and you're really trying to change, are you being sort of like judged on the desire to be better, or are you, because that's just something that really troubles me, because I think a lot about the fact that I want to be a certain way, but I can't. I try really hard to, and it's really hard for me. I'm wondering if it's just ordained for me, or is there going to, passive me on what I'm trying to do?
It's a sliding scale, yes. One of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it's a sound hadith, he said that the people who come after he was speaking to the Sahaba, and he said the people who come after you who will do 1/10 or even 1/50th, I think, of what you do, and they will get the same reward. And he said 1/50th of what they do or what we do? He said no, what you do. So that indicates that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't wrong anyone, and He's well aware of our circumstances and well aware of the obstacles that we have that stand between us and where we want to be. And obviously people who are living and breathing the same air as the Prophet ﷺ and walking behind him in his footsteps are going to be in a slightly different position than people who live 1500 years later, right? And can only see him via those who are exemplars of that prophetic way, and when their numbers dwindle, there's not many of them, and at the same time there's people who kind of pretend to be or think they are and lead people the other way. Allah knows all of that, right? All of that is well known. So what one person does in this particular time that we're living in is going to be judged in a way by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is completely just. One of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muqsit, and Al-Muqsit means the one who judges completely, equitably and perfectly. We don't call justice in this life qist, right? It's only talked about the next life. When Allah says وَنَضَعَ الْمَوَازِينَ الْقِسْطَ الْيَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, Mawazin al-Qist, we will put the scales of justice. He said qist, not adl, because adl means you're trying to balance. Like if you have the scale with the two things, what's that called? The one, So when if you go to the old markets in the Middle East, if you put your groceries here, and then he has these weights. But people don't do this anymore. Even this country used to do it. And then, he's trying to balance the scale. So the adl in this, and adl also means the balance of either side. Like idli ba'ir, similar word, Surah Yusuf, was what you have on either side of the camel, which was the bida'a, which was the goods. So you have to balance. You can't put on the left side of the camel too much and then stress the animal. So you balance either side, right? Like the lapsack, you balance either side of those. So in this life, it's approximate. Because if human beings are entrusted to that, then we're just trying to maintain a balance. But with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-qist, it's not just balancing, it's not a balancing act. It's completely just. So no one gets wronged in the next life, right? So, we can't compare ourselves obviously to the Sahaba and the ones who came after them and their taqwa and their proximity to the Prophet ﷺ. But nevertheless, we should have husn al-dhan, good suspicion, good hope, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will adjust us according to, our own particular circumstances. It should not be a crutch we lean on either, right? We shouldn't say, I live in this place and there's no good Muslims around me, so what's the point? We shouldn't do that either. We strive, we struggle, we continue, we try to maintain, and because that's what Allah asks of us. He exhorts us to try to reach taqwa, to try to go towards this. And ultimately, if you don't reach it, right, for whatever reason, or there's something preventing us from doing it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is too merciful than to, take us into account on something that was outside of our control. If it really was outside of, what we would say outside the, not control, but outside of the understanding of taklif, of what we're going to be held morally responsible for. So hence, the insane person, the sleeping person, the unconscious person. In other words, if we don't have our faculties altogether there, then we're not judged. And I think you can think of it as the completely insane person is completely not judged. In other words, they have complete total loss of intellect. They have no ability to discern right from wrong. And now we live in an age where there's, I get asked the question all the time, well, there are people who are not like really insane, but they're like schizophrenic, or they have, they're on meds and they got certain mental issues. You can't really say they're completely insane. So are they mukallaf? Are they morally responsible, or are they not? I can't answer that question, Allahu a'lam. But I think we can infer that at the very least, if they have diminished capacity, right, to discern things and do things, then I can't imagine that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not judge them according to whatever diminished capacity that they have. Especially it's something they didn't bring on themselves, it's just, a byproduct of their circumstances. Wallahu a'lam, But what we do know is that there is no injustice. No one will feel any injustice in the next life. And in fact, if Allah were to deal with us by His adl, by His justice, we'd all be in a lot of trouble. Right? None of us would enter paradise if that were the case. But if He deals with us by His mercy, with His maghfirah, then we're hopeful. Right? Because that means He's going to let a lot of things go. وَيَعْفُ عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. Right? And He pardons many things. This is where we keep our hope.
I think I wanted to just clarify, like, if you're looking at your situation and you have, wow, when I was young, I could have done all these things but I didn't, and now I'm at this point in my life where it's really hard to just, throw everything away and go over to the Middle East and learn and become like really scholarly, right? So knowing that you want to really aim high, but understanding that it's going to take God to get there. What I'm trying to understand is like, is this effort of like wanting but not being able to
To be honest with you, I think you kind of have you're framing issues in a frame that I think it's too hard on yourself. Yani, plus, to be completely honest with you, this notion that people have is like, leave everything and go to the Middle East and study, and it's not happening. The way the Middle East is right now, no one is going there anymore. And I don't advocate anyone go over there. There's no country I can recommend. The countries I've studied in are a mess. I can't point you to any place to go to do that. And I think at this point, as Americans living in America, we're kind of on our own. Right? There's no, seriously, there's no, yeah, there's plenty of people who studied there for whatever period of time, short time, a long time, doesn't matter. But, we have to kind of get things done here, right? People who come back and then, people go to a few classes of theirs and they're like, wow, I want to do that too. Well, why don't you help the person who's actually back and, some of them are parking cars and trying to do other stuff to feed their family, and, you want to run off to the Middle East too. No, stay here and establish something that will serve the needs of the Muslims here, right? For example, Allah has put you in a position where you're supporting the first full-fledged Muslim college in the United States. It's not an accident, right? He put you there for a reason, right? And this opened up things for you, and things that you've seen, things that you realized. Now you're building experience with that. Maybe, who knows where that's going to take you at. So everybody's going to serve in different ways. Don't think that the epitome of having the best relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means, throwing everything away and then moving to a village in Yemen. If people really want to do that, I'm not going to discourage them. They're free to do that. But don't think that you have to do that, or even that's actually the thing that you need to do in order to fulfill what you think is the best thing to do with your life. The best thing to do with your life is where Allah has put you. Look around and see, where can I serve? Where can I help? So where you are is where you're supposed to be. You're not supposed to be anywhere else. And if you're supposed to be somewhere else, then Allah will put you in that place. Right? So that they say, like, don't hope for this place or that place or this thing, because Allah doesn't need you to hope for it for Him to take you there. If He wanted you there, He put you there. He wants you here.
Function of angels. Are we to understand that, yes, there are angels that restore, angels that protect, angels which encourage, but Allah Ta'ala will also veil certain acts from ourselves and veil certain acts from our angels as an act of forgiveness and forbearance. And perhaps just reflecting on this, because it's a very generous blessing of our understanding our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The better, perhaps, inshallah.
I agree. Yeah, that's true. Alhamdulillah. I mean, here you see something that many Muslims have taken to go towards the scientific miracle aspect of things, but to me, I'm looking at them and see, like, subhanAllah, from the womb, Allah was taking care of us. Right? From the womb, He had an angel who was there taking the commands from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's the angel speaking here. It says, Ya Rab, saying, my Lord, alaqa, should I make it an alaqa? Right? Should this come together and become alaqa? Right? Because not every sperm that meets every ovary or egg fertilizes. Right? They say the chances are 1 in like 1 billion of them happen or something like that. So not every single one happens, but there's an angel there, and when Allah says yes, right? That's a choice Allah made, choice He made for you to happen. What bigger blessing is that than that? When you think about it, right? There are 1 billion other sperm and not 1 billion eggs. Every woman has few hundred, I think, right? But any of those combinations could have been someone completely different and not you. But Allah chose you. And then to move on to the next stages as well, right? To become a alaqa, to fertilize and hook to the womb, to become a mudgha, right? Mukhallaqa. And as Surah Al-Hajj says, وَغَيْرُ مُخَلَّقَ. There are some that don't make it that far. Right? And then التسوية وَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. The taqweem and building in the perfect sense. And then النفخ الروح. And then the blowing of the soul, the spirit, which is divine in origin. Right? Which is unseen, which is part of the malakuti world, malakuti realm, not part of this earthly realm. All of these things are understood, and they're huge, immense blessings, and it gives you an idea of actually who you are, right? You're not just some blip in the universe that's insignificant, like they want us to think. It's not like, because it's not about size, it's not about quantity. The soul itself, the human soul, is something that can't be quantified. It can't be measured. It can't be circumscribed to something particular. It's given immortality. Once that soul goes in the womb, you're immortal. Right? He gave you immortality. So, just a brief note on the microcosm and the macrocosm. So here describing the human being and how it develops. This hadith doesn't mention it, but the Quran certainly mentions that after the full formation of the body and the soul, and then it's born and it grows up, but then something comes after that. ثم ضعف وشيبة وهرم. There will be weakness, there will be growing old, and then haram أرذل العمر, as the Quran talks about, which is the lowest, not the lowest form, but sort of the lowest experience of life, when people reach that really old age, when they are barely functioning now, right? Their capacity to understand things, to hear things, to see things, physically even, is diminished, and it's a sign for us, right? So just as the microcosm, we can see that it decays and eventually will diminish and not be there anymore, the same thing will happen with the macrocosm, with the world, with the universe. It's the same thing. The one who is capable of doing that and showing that to us, right? It's cyclical. Today, driving, I can see the trees blooming and, spring is coming to life, but in a few months, all that will be gone. And then the same thing will happen next year. These are all signs for someone to reflect, right? Allah could have made it not like that. Could have made it completely different, right? But this unity in the universe, the tawheed, right, between the macrocosm, the terrestrial realm, and the microcosm, us, the terrestrial realm, and then even all the things within the terrestrial realm, all that unity, all of that tawheed, right? The soulless ones want to call it natural selection, but we say that's divine selection, right? Allah chose all of that perfectly, in perfect order, perfect cosmic order, both above and below. Despite what people think, that looks like chaos and looks like disorder, but it's all part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His tartib, part of His plan. So we should reflect on ourselves to reflect on the universe and the world itself, right? And even if we do say the universe had a birth, there was nothing, then there was the universe, right? And the Quran seems to indicate that, for example, كانت السماوات والأرض رتقا ففتقناهما وجعلنا من الماء كل شيء حي. That the heavens and the earth were one. ففتقناهما. Then we separated them, and we made everything. We brought life out from the water. وجعلنا من الماء كل شيء حي. So that indicates that there was a development of the universe. Right? So it was nothing. You want to call what happened next to Big Bang? Fine, whatever. I don't know what happened, but certainly it was nothing. Then Allah created it, it began to form. The Quran indicates it was 6 days, not days like our days, but those 6 days are symbolic of that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He chose to create it in developmental stages, just like He chose to create us in developmental stages. Because He can just say kun fayakun. He can say and it will be. He could have made us, born as adults, like Mork and Mindy. Only one person got that reference, and that was a person I thought who would get it too. None of you know what I'm talking about, right? See, you're showing your age. Yeah, that's okay. But He chose for us to develop over stages, just like He chose for the universe, right? And that end of that ayah, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ, so that you may reflect. So just as you reflect on this, reflect on that. And that's what they mean by the book of creation. Kitabun Mastur wa Kitabun Makhluq. There's a book that's in lines, the Quran, but it indicates to you what's going on in the whole book of creation. So you need to read both books. If you only read one, you'll be deficient, you don't understand. But you read both, and you see them really as single source. They're both from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran is kalam Allah. It's Allah's speech. It's how He communicates to us via language. Whereas this is also another way that Allah communicates to us. So, I think we'll move on to the next one. And one last thing actually that I want to point out is the last part of this hadith, فَيُكْتَبُ فِي بَطْنِ أُمِّهِ. So it's written in the belly or the abdomen of his mother. That's not insignificant either. That of all the places Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to symbolize, because this was already obviously in the Lawh al-Mahfuz, in the sacred tablet before we even created what was going to happen to us and when and all of that. But He chose to manifest it in the womb of the mother. Right? And such a lofty and weighty thing to be manifested in the womb of the mother, right? And al-jannatu tahtu aqdam al-ummahat, and Jannah is at paradise is at the feet of the mothers. So motherhood in general even it's an indescribable thing. I can't describe it because I'll never have it. But those who are, and when you have that embryo, that fetus, that human being developing inside of you, and Allah chose the mother for that particular purpose, right? How can anyone after that kind of diminish the importance of that role, right? And it's souls are being formed, right? And souls, what's going to be written for them, what's going to happen to them, taking place inside that human being, inside the womb of the mother. And so the place of the mother is very lofty in Islam. It's something that can't be overemphasized, the importance of it. And it's only by relation of the father to that role is he included as well. So for example, it's known as filial piety, but it's translated from the Arabic bir al-walidain. The walid or the walida is the one who bears the child. In reality, that's really only the mother, right? Because walid means the one that is born. So the husband or the father has a secondary role in that he doesn't technically bear the child, but because of his relationship to the mother, he's by extension given that piety or that good behavior that should be on the part of the children towards the parent. And that's why in the Prophet ﷺ, when someone asked him who should the one I should have most emphasis on my companionship towards, he said ummuk, and then your mother, and then your mother 3 times. Then he said the father. So it shows it's by extension that the father comes from that. When you find in the Quran it talks about abawain though. Al-ab is the father. Al-abawan means father and mother. But who's the primary here? the father. Where in the Quran does it say abawain? What context? I was going to give a prize, no one's getting it. It talks about it in the context of inheritance. In the context of inheritance, it says al-abawain. وَلِأَبِوَيْهِ مِثْلِ كَذَا يعني. Surah An-Nisa, yeah. So they said the reason for this is because really the primary person that you're inheriting from, being that the father is the one who is supposed to provide for the family, and so the emphasis on him having an estate and earning a living. So he is seen as the primary focus of those verses because they deal with inheritance. Whereas the mother is secondary. So it didn't say al-walidain, but it said al-abawain. Wallahu a'lam. So the next hadith, we have some time, right? 10 minutes, I think, at least. The next three hadith, which I think we'll try to get through tonight, are all somewhat related, but we're going to see, inshallah, how they differ and how they compare. So this one, عن جابر بن عبد الله وابي سعيد رضي الله عنهما صليا في السفينة قائمين وقال الحسن تصلي قائما ما لم تشق على أصحابك تدور معها وإلا فقاعدا. So Jabir and Abu Sa'id prayed, it's narrated on them, on a boat standing. Al-Hasan, who is the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, said, it could be Hasan al-Basri, I'm not 100% sure about that. I'm not 100% sure. So either Hasan al-Basri, because usually when they say Al-Hasan, it's referring to Al-Hasan al-Basri. But I don't have here in, it doesn't say here specifically. So I'll have to verify that. So Al-Hasan said, pray standing, so as long as it is not difficult on your companions, otherwise sitting. So first we see in this hadith there's no reference to whom? Direct reference to the Prophet ﷺ. No direct reference to him. Nevertheless, it's one of the hadith of Imam al-Bukhari. And nevertheless, it's seen as a hujjah, as something where we can understand how to live our deen from the acts of the Sahaba themselves, even though the Prophet ﷺ is not mentioned directly. And the Prophet ﷺ, he is narrated to have said, Ashabi kan nujum, bi'ayyihim iqtadaytum ihtadaytum. They're like the stars, whichever ones that you follow, you will be guided. And so there's varying levels of difference of opinion amongst the four schools of thought about the level by which we take the actions of the Sahaba to be a proof, but all of them more or less acknowledge that it is a type of valid proof, but they differ about when it seemingly contradicts with something else, should that something else take precedence or not. So the fact of the act of the Sahaba is considered to be legislative, especially when it's understood that that particular acts were done during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, if it was done during the lifetime, it clearly says that they did it during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. Like the hadith we're going to read later about praying, prostrating on top of your clothing, they say, "Kunna nusalli fi zaman al-Nabi," or we used to do this in the time of the Prophet. When they say that, then that indicates that it is not just act of the Sahaba anymore, but it's a sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Why? Because we can't understand that they would have done that except either the Prophet ﷺ, if it was not right, he would have told them so. So his silence, as we said, indicates his approval about something, if it happened during his lifetime. So anyway, this hadith is interesting to me because it gives us an idea of, one, as I just mentioned, the idea of the Sahaba and their acts and what they do as being authoritative. And two, how we were to understand those particular acts even a generation or two after they happen. So Abu Sa'id al-Khudri and Jabir, they were two of the Sahaba, and they prayed in the boat standing up. We could leave the text at that, right? And we can just say, if you're in a boat, you have to pray standing up. And left it at that. But Sayyidina al-Hasan, whether it's al-Hasan al-Basri, most likely al-Hasan al-Basri, said that he had to add an addendum to this, a note to this particular hadith. So he says, تصلي قائما ما لم تشق على أصحابك تدور معها وإلا فقاعدا. He had to do what exactly? What is he doing here? He's clarifying. In other words, he's telling people, don't understand that hadith literally. You can't understand it literally. Because if you understand it literally, then you might go outside what is the predominant aspect of the Sharia Samha, which is a forgiving Sharia, not one that is unduly harsh. Because if you take it literally, you might have some undue, you might bring about some undue harshness on people when it's not called for. So it's predicated on the idea you are to pray standing up if you're able to do so. ما لم تشق على أصحابك, as long as you don't bring undue difficulty upon your companions. But even that needs to be interpreted, right? Because what's mashaqqa? What's difficulty? What does that mean? If I'm to take it literally, I would say, well, I'm pretty hungry right now, and it'd be difficult for me to stand either way, either sitting down or praying, or sitting down or standing up, and I'd rather just eat, and I don't want to go to that difficulty. And yeah, it's difficult. I have to bend down, and you know what? That's difficult. For that person, it could be difficult. Is that difficulty considered or not? So again, if you take it literally, you can also go outside the understanding of what this difficulty is to be. So to properly understand the original action of Jabir, Sayyidina Jabir and Abu Sa'id, one, we have to know what the other ulama said about it, namely someone like al-Hasan al-Basri, and also someone like al-Bukhari or Ibn Abi Jamrah, who saw this and they described to us, well, what's mashaqqa? What's difficulty? Right? Hardship. And they define hardship. Hardship means real hardship. You know, like fear of loss of life or loss of limb or loss of faculty. These are the true hardships. That type of hardship. Or in this particular case, a hardship to the extent that you will not be able to complete the prayer. You just couldn't. You'll become so dizzy, or you become nauseous, seasick, and you will wind up, vomiting and not doing the prayer. So obviously, we're not to pray to the extent where we feel completely seasick and then continue nonetheless standing up and try to face the Qibla as we're doing so, because we feel nauseous. So the mashaqqa here has, it's qualified, and it can only be qualified in the extent if you take it in understanding with all of the nusus, all of the other texts. By this hadith alone, you probably cannot determine what difficulty actually is, to what extent. But if you understand it in the context of the concept of mashaqqa or difficulty in the Sharia to begin with, which is only something an understanding the ulama can deliver to us, then you understand what is meant by this hadith. So, do we have time? I don't think it's time. 7:54? Okay. So I'll try to finish this hadith. So that's one point about this hadith. The other one is, and this will be the recurrent theme in the next two hadith after this, is they were doing something, or it's advocated to do something, namely the turning towards the Qibla, which is what Al-Hasan added, is something that seems outside of the normal acts of the prayer. Because when I'm in the prayer, I face the Qibla. Am I supposed to turn in any direction while I'm praying? Not ordinarily. I am not. So here, Al-Hasan says, you are to turn with the boat to face the Qibla, if you can. But no, ordinarily that's an act that you wouldn't do. If I'm standing here in the mihrab here, I'm not going to turn left and right. In fact, it would probably invalidate my prayer if it was done to the extent that it looks like I'm not praying anymore. According to the Malikis or to the Shafi'is, if I do it like 3 movements in a row that are not from the prayer, then it would invalidate the prayer. So here we're talking about doing things that may be extraneous to the prayer, but if there's a valid reason behind them. So the valid reason here is that you're doing it for the prayer, not for any other reason. So if one were on the boat and they were to turn left and right because they're trying to hear what someone is saying to them, that's an invalidating act, likely. But if they're turning to stay with the Qibla, it's not. So it depends on the reason why there is this, what they call al-amal al-yasir, while there's this some slight extraneous movement to the prayer. So if it's for the integrity of the prayer, for the validity of the prayer, then it's allowed, right? Like normally if we're praying behind in the imam and he makes a mistake, he doesn't rise from, he doesn't sit down for the tashahhud in the middle or whatever. What do? We say subhanallah, which is not alien to the prayer, because the prayer is dua and dhikr and so forth. But however, it's normally not something we would say out of turn within the prayer. But we do it, why? لأجل الصلاة, because of the prayer itself, to maintain the integrity of the prayer itself. Similarly, if they said that if you are praying and someone knocks, this is found in some of the Hanafi books, if you're praying and someone knocks on the door and you want to let them in, what do? They said, if you're at a point in the prayer where you could read a verse, he said, read the verse that would indicate to them that they're allowed to come in. Like, udkhuluha bisalamin aminin, which was referring to Egypt. But here he said, enter, with peace and tranquility. And then the person at the door, oh, I get it. He's praying, but he wants me to come in. And that was something also they mentioned in the fiqh of it. So it seems like we'll stop here, inshallah, and we'll continue with this after the prayer, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.